So Ruth very kindly and not pre-planned by us together took us to the question of identity. If you were watching the football match last night, who did you support? Why did you support them? Probably because you felt some sense of identity with the team you were supporting. If you looked at this morning's reading in the prayer handbook, you find that it's the reading from the beginning of John, where the disciples are called, and the disciples of John are pointed to Jesus and they follow, and one of them is Andrew, and he goes and collects his brother Simon and takes him to Jesus, and Jesus says to him, "You are Simon, son of John, you will be Cephas." A change of identity. Identity is a moot point in our culture these days. How you refer to yourself and how you want others to refer to you is a live debate. Those of you who've been on lots of Zoom gatherings will regularly recognize that people will sometimes not only put their name, but how they want to be referred to, which pronouns they'd like you to use. Might say he, him, she, her, or them, they. And the latter has come about because some people don't want to be automatically gender labeled. They don't want that to be given to them as their identity. They want to define themselves in a different way. And I recognize that that happens at all sorts of levels, and particularly in a post-colonial world, we recognize that the names sometimes that have been given by the powerful to others are not welcome names, and people want to change the way they're referred to. They want to define that themselves. So we're careful now, much more than we were, about how we label groups and countries and individuals, because identity is really special and important. Labels are not always welcome, but sometimes they stick. Methodists ought to be acutely aware of this. Those who were in the Holy Club were labelled Methodists as a kind of insult because of their methodical study, their strict routines, their orderliness in everything from their prayers to their visits to the prison. And John Wesley was never wholly comfortable with the name Methodist. If you look in his writings, he does use that term, but he prefers the term people called Methodist. And yet we have stuck with it. And I guess we've stuck with it because we've become proud of some of the associations it carries. We're glad to own that we're a church that proclaims grace for all and a welcome to everyone. That we have a concern for those who are in poverty and a desire to act in social action. And we have a passion for hymn singing. Those are things that most Methodists are proud about. And even when we don't live up to those ideals, we aspire to them because we recognize that our identity is in that word and in that calling. And I guess primitive Methodism took the term primitive because it wanted to relate to Wesley's idea of going back to the earliest church. Wesley himself talks about primitive Christianity. And that name was taken as a desire to be in line and to be good successors to those early disciples. Even though the word primitive can be used as an insult both now and then. So this issue of identity, who are we, is a really key issue. When we were looking at Methodist Way of Life, we went for the term way of life rather than rule of life. We've been looking at rules of life from various communities, the Iona community, the Northumbria community, some of the new communities in North America, and many of them use the term rule. But we were drawn to the notion of a way of life, I think for three reasons. The first is that perhaps Methodists already have too many rules, and we just didn't need that. And for some people, the word rule would not have good associations. And in any case, what we felt about the Methodist way of life was that it wasn't a set of rules or commandments or even commitments at its heart. It was rather an invitation into a way of life. But the most important reason that we went for way was because it has deep, deep roots in the Bible, in particular in the New Testament. So we know that, many of you will know that in Acts 11, I think actually, I'm not sure about that now. I'm not sure whether that was noted down wrongly, but you will know that at Antioch, the Christians were first named as such. But before that, clearly a name that was associated with the Christians was the followers of the way. And we picked this up kind of slightly incidentally through Luke's version of what Paul did and said. So in Acts 9, we hear, meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Any who belonged to the way. Acts 9 comes before Acts 11 and Acts 13. And it implies that it's an earlier name than Christian for the followers of Jesus. And later on in Acts, when Paul's giving his own testimony, he says, I persecuted the followers of the way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. This notion of followers of the way was clearly part of the identity, whether given by others or whether taken themselves, it's not clear. It's possible that Paul thought the way was a deviant way, was a doctrinally unsound way, was a divisive way. It may be that the term is given by others as a kind of insult, or it may be that it's taken by the Christians themselves. We can't be 100% sure, but it's interesting that it's there. And I thought today we might explore what the kind of echoes and resonances are for this notion of being followers of the way. So there is almost certainly some kind of link into Old Testament ideas of the way. In Psalm 25, it tells us the humble can learn God's way. And it's significant here in Isaiah 35, a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the holy way. The unclean shall not travel on it, but it shall be for God's people. No traveller, not even fool, shall go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there, and the ransomed of the Lord shall return. And come to Zion with singing, everlasting joy shall be upon their head, and they shall obtain joy and gladness. Sorrow and sighing shall flee away. A holy way. Now, this is clearly some kind of reference to the regathering of God's people from exile. But it's interesting that this holy way seems to occur in the Isaiah community. Probably talking about more than one person who writes, a community that holds a particular tradition, but through it, you get this reference to the way of God, the holy way. What we take to be the call of 2nd Isaiah in Isaiah 40 carries this notion at its heart. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that she has served her term, that her penalty is paid and she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground shall be made level, and the rough places a plain. Then the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all people shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. It has some roots there, and that notion of a way of God, a holy way, possibly links into this term, followers of the way. But of course, it has New Testament resonances too. When Mark opens his gospel, he begins with the words, as it's written in the prophet Isaiah, see, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. Picking up directly from Isaiah. But small is the gate and narrow the way that leads to life, and only a few find it, says Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And of course, as we've already focused in this on this text in Michael's prayers, Jesus said to them, I am the way and the truth and the life. So what you get here is you get a sense that the early Christians may have been happy to own this, whether it was their articulation or whether it was given to them by others. They were happy to own it because it related to their faith in Jesus and the way in which they wanted to follow, and it had deep roots in the Hebrew scriptures. Here's a lovely little message translation of James as kind of indicating something about the nature of identity in the way you live and the practices you follow. Do you want to be counted wise? To build a reputation for wisdom? Here's what to do. Live well, live wisely, live humbly. It's the way you live, not the way you talk, that counts. So what kind of identity, what is the pattern of living that the early Christians offer to us that help us to understand our own identity as followers of the way? Well, of course, we get the Lucan passage, which gives us that early church cameo. I'll read this through. So those who welcomed his message were baptized. That day, about 3,000 persons were added. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. The awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the good will of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. Now, whether this gives us accurate, detailed, historical account, or whether Luke has polished this a little bit to give us a picture of what the ideal church might be, it nevertheless is quite a significant passage. And of course, it's repeated in part in chapter 4. You'll be familiar, I think, with Andrew Roberts' work on holy habits. This text is really important for him. He argues that you can find in this text, in Acts chapter 4, 10 Christian practices, which I've listed there for you. Whether you entirely agree with Andrew or not, it certainly is true that at the heart of that passage, there are a set of practices which the Christians engaged with, which in some ways not only gave us a picture of the church, but gave us a sense of the identity of those Christians. And I think this comes at a point really in our own reading where practical theology has become much more dominant as a feature of theology. So there are various branches and explorations of theology, biblical and systematic and so on. But practical theology, which comes from Schleiermacher originally, has kind of gone through a bit of a renaissance in the last 50 years. And it has a particular emphasis on looking at the not belief in itself, but how belief is carried in the practices that people follow. And there's a whole community that works at this quite seriously. In one sense, you could say it's implicit theology. What is it we can sense about what people believe by the way they live? What is it that their practices carry that tell us something about God? And it's here that in some ways I want us to focus a bit. In what ways do practices tell us about identity? Elaine Heath, now I don't know whether you can, I'm hoping that you're able to see the stool as well as the writing here. This is quite important. Elaine Heath has done quite a lot of work in the last few years, North American, working at Duke, I think, at the moment, and has for many years been engaged in training those who would be ordained and serve the church. And she tells in one of her books how many people had come to her in training saying, kind of looking for a different way of living out the Christian faith, and particularly amongst those who are marginalized from the church or don't any longer belong to it. And so she's written a lot about that, and she wrote a little bit about rules of life in that pattern too. But I was quite interested in what she said about practices. So I'm going to read her quote. Let's imagine discipleship formation has a three-legged stool. The flat part of the stool you sit on is doctrine. The three legs that support the seat are sets of practices. One leg is a set of practices called prayer. Another leg is a set of practices called hospitality. A third leg is a set of practices called justice. The entire stool is able to support the weight of human life individually and corporately when all the pieces are in place. Discipleship formation requires formation in all the practices as well as beliefs. But practices are foundational. This is why in the early church, Christianity was known as the way. I think when she spoke at one Christian conference in this country, she said quite provocatively, if you have to choose where to start, you shouldn't start with doctrine, you should start with practices. And I'd be quite interested to know what you think about that, because it does seem to invite us into a different way of thinking about identity and about Christian discipleship formation. So I thought we might take a break at this point. We're going to have 10 minutes. And the questions will come through in the chat, so you'll be able to see them. But just so that you're aware before we go, I really want to know what you make of that three-legged stool. Doctrine on the top, prayer, hospitality, and justice as the legs. And then I want you to kind of talk together a little bit about, do practices come before doctrine in Christian nurture? And when you've had some conversation together, we'll come back together and have a little bit more as a general group. I hope that makes sense. Ruth will do all the magic to give you your room and your conversation partners.
Okay, thank you, Roger. I've now opened the room, so hopefully you will be able to see where you're heading. So if you just click the breakout room number, you can head off. There's one person unassigned, Debs. I will just assign you to a room. Just bear with me. There you go, Debs. I hope you've got that. Has it come through to you, Debs? Sorry, you're muted. Sorry, you're still muted. I can't hear you. Sorry. Bottom left hand corner usually is the unmute.
I apologise, Ruth. I was late joining you this morning. So
Don't worry.
I've got the join 5. Yes, I found it now. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. And I don't think this gentleman joined a group last week. So
Glenn, yeah, I don't think he did.
And that's fine.
He's obviously happy just to listen
into
what's being said. Is that okay? So we're obviously coming back about 10 past. When do you want to do the break? I didn't mention that.
No, neither did I. When had you planned it for after this first?
Well, what we could do is we could, if we bring them back at 10 past, 5 to 10 minutes conversation. You know what happened?
Yeah.
What did you think? And then have the break.
Yeah.
So I reckon that takes us to about 20 past, 25 past, and then I've got a bit more to do and another session to offer them in there.
Okay, yeah, I'll bring them back at 10 past then, and for the chat, and then we'll break at 20 past. Yeah, that's fine.
Yep, is that okay?
Yeah,
Brilliant.
No problem at all. Okay, I'll head into a group.
Great, enjoy.
Thank you. Fascinating question. How do I join a group? Good.
Hi, Ruth.
Hello. Hi.
We can't seem to make.
Usually when I'm responding, I say, well, of course, the Way of Life legs are 4 anyway, so you know you're actually kind of.
And I couldn't help noticing that my uncle, when he was milking a cow, would sometimes just swing the stool on 2 legs. So.
Wonderful. Yeah, I suspect, yeah, when you're really skilled, you can do it probably even on 1. I bet there are some who can do that.
Depends on your cow, I would say.
Yes, it's really outside my experience when we get to that point. Now, shall we move on a little bit? I'm going to share again the PowerPoint and just get you to the right place. Let's just do sharing. I want to go here. Okay. I want to come at it in a different way. I mean, I think we're all fairly at ease with the idea of the importance of practices in terms of Christian identity, and the way in which practices form our identity. And I want to kind of come at this from a slightly different angle now, and see what you make of this. When I was doing research for the last book I did, which was really fundamentally about small groups and their role in formation, I began to notice that that the way in which the Gospels portray discipleship and how disciples are formed.
Is there a way for me to disable word saving for the cloud?
Is that what's causing it?
I don't know, but it's the only internet that I'm using.
That Matthew's Gospel
I don't know how.
sees the formation of disciples through education or learning. So you know that Matthew collects Jesus's teaching into 5 blocks, a bit like Moses's 5 books of the law. Jesus talks to people through 5 lots of teaching, and each of those is about discipleship, what it means to be a disciple. Some of it is very radical and very challenging, but it's about being a disciple. In fact, some people have argued that Matthew's Gospel was originally a kind of manual for the formation of discipleship.
Yeah, there's no
Ruth, you're a bit unmuted there.
Sorry.
And so Matthew has a kind of view that disciples are those who listen carefully and respond to the teaching of Jesus and build their house on the rock. And Matthew has this lovely, unique phrase of his: every scribe who's trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out his treasure, what is new and what is old. So Matthew is very keen that his readers hold on to what they know from Moses and the law, but also add to it new treasures that come from Jesus about how we are formed in the way for God. Mark is quite contrasting in the way he sets out. It's a shorter gospel anyway, and was probably known to Matthew, but if you take Mark on its own, you find it's like an action movie. It doesn't have very much teaching in it. And after you've read Matthew through, it's a bit of a shock to come to Mark because there's very little teaching. In fact, before chapter 8, you only get a tiny bit about parables of the kingdom. And then after chapter 8, you find that Jesus does do teaching, but it almost always comes out of encounters or problems that have arisen in the community. So, for example, James and John, they want to be on the left hand and the right hand, and Jesus then says, right, there's an opportunity to learn something here. The kingdom isn't like that. It's not about who has power and everybody else underneath, but the person who serves is the person who is first in the kingdom. And so most of the teaching of Jesus in Mark's gospel comes in the second half, and nearly all of it comes out of particular encounters. We can't do this now, but it's worth reading through and seeing just what kind of action movie this is. It moves from one thing to another all the time, and it goes to some very uncomfortable places, and people have to go with Jesus into those uncomfortable places because that's what the kingdom's about. That's what discipleship is about. And in those places, they are formed in conversation with Jesus, in conversation with each other, but most of all, out of encounter. So Mark, kind of underneath, is saying the way in which you are formed as a disciple is as you engage in mission. And I guess if you thought into your own life, and you thought about some of those really formative experiences that have given you insight into what it means to be a Christian, they may well be in uncomfortable places and in places where you were challenged and were uncomfortable and had to act in new ways, and then you found you were blessed. That in those places, God was meeting you. God was meeting you in mission and forming you. So Matthew takes this idea, it's through learning about Jesus and acting on it. Mark takes it that is acting on it and then learning through it. So it's really quite different in terms of formation. Luke is complex and has many themes. I don't want to be taken to imply that this is the only theme, but there's a very interesting notion that happens in Acts. When you look at the gospel, you find it begins and ends in worship. Well, there's that little bit where Luke says, Theophilus, I've been gathering these things together and so on. But then he starts the story, and the story is in the temple, and Zechariah is there, and the story unfolds out of that place of worship. And the last sentence in Luke's gospel is that they were continually in the temple blessing God. When you follow that through in Acts, you find that some of the key moments of the changes of direction and the impulses to mission come in worship. It's like Luke bookends his gospel to say to us, this whole thing is wrapped around and found in the life of worship. Other things are going on in Luke, without doubt. The power of the Spirit, the importance of women, the how you do wealth, and how you respond to poverty. All those things are in Luke, but it's found within the shape and pattern and flow of worship. When you've read Luke's gospel and then you read John through, again, you have a bit of a shock because they are so different. Where Luke is concerned about the poor, you hardly get that mentioned in John's gospel. There's only one reference to the poor in John's gospel, and that says, that Judas kept the purse for giving to the poor. So it indicates there was some concern, but basically it just doesn't figure as part of the teaching of Jesus. In fact, it feels like it's a very almost closed community in John's gospel. And there, instead of the stuff about mission or education, though of course they're part of it, the main thrust is about how you are with each other. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you. And the model disciple, the beloved disciple, who we all assume was John himself, but we don't know. There's no firm evidence on that. And maybe, but you do notice some things about it, that at the Last Supper, the beloved disciple has his head resting on the bosom of Jesus. And then you read back at the beginning, in the opening of John's Gospel, and you find it's the Son whose head is resting in the bosom of God. And that there's something about closeness of community in John's Gospel. It's almost as if he is saying to us, the way in which you are with each other will tell the world what it is you believe. In fact, if you love one another as I've loved you, then the world will know that the Father has sent you. So what you've got in the Gospels is a sort of sense of being formed in slightly different ways. For Matthew, it's through learning, through attention to what Jesus teaches us. In Mark, it's by participation in mission. There's a lovely commentary on Mark that made the statement that Jesus is always ahead in Mark's gospel. Well, we haven't got time to do the text on that, but it's there if you look at it. Jesus is always ahead. You're following Jesus into mission, into uncomfortable places, into places of pain and fear and so on, and discovering that God is there. In Luke, it's all sorts of things, but they're wrapped around in worship. And in John, it's as you are formed in a loving community that you become a true disciple of Jesus, a beloved disciple. So what you have here is some sense of how we are formed through particular practices, through learning, through participation in mission, through worship, and through community. So what I thought we might do at this point is go back to groups and give ourselves 10 minutes in groups and just see what you made of what I've just shared. You can say, well, I've never heard such rubbish in all my life. You can say that, you know, that's all right. But what I'd like you to discuss is if that's a theme of those Gospels and how disciples are formed, which of those four do you immediately identify with? And then go back to the question, are practices the key to identity for us as people of the way? And if none of those work, have a look at 3. What does being a follower of the way mean for you? We've got 10 minutes and then we'll have a few minutes to have conversation together before we finish. So I'll stop sharing and Ruth will do the magic.
Apologies for interrupting. We were trying to work out how to stop the computer freezing by Amy not uploading things automatically onto the cloud. Anyway, I think we've cracked it. I'm going to put you into the same rooms as you were in last time. And I think coming back, Roger, at 11:54, 10 minutes.
10 minutes exactly, yep. That's
Super,
great.
okay.
But any comments or questions from that conversation you had in your small group? Please feel free to unmute yourself and just start the conversation if you'd like to.
I think Roger, we found the ways of learning that you kind of put out through the 4 Gospels incredibly helpful. It was really, really helpful. And I think for all of us, it's about looking at the Gospels with a new eye, and also situational learning. That was great. And the other thing, we felt a real community in our group because somebody was in Taiwan, somebody's in hospital, but we felt St. John's Gospel very much, that we were a community.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
wonderful.
So thank you.
Thank you, Francis. I love that last bit about being that community that reflects John's Gospel.
I think we say that at different times, different aspects affect the way we learn, the way we are, and what we become. That it's very difficult to say that this is the most important bit, because at different times in our lives and in different situations, the other bits have been important as well.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you.
I think we thought about number 1 a little bit more lengthily than the others, and I know that one of us thought that John's Gospel spoke to us because of the idea of community, and if you love one another, the world will know that you are my disciples. It's about doing, we thought, rather than believing, doing rather than doctrine, action rather than thought and belief. And then one of us also loved the bit that you'd said, Roger, about Jesus going before us into mission, whereby you might be really insecure or really stepping into the unknown in some way, and that was a lovely thought for that, that Jesus goes before us.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Heather. Yeah. Maybe just take one more and then perhaps Michael will wrap up. Anybody else got anything to say? Okay, Michael, I think it's with you.
Well, thanks very much, as ever, Roger, for leading us this morning. Been absolutely fascinating. I've certainly learned an awful lot, and particularly the last bit about the 4 Gospels and the focusing on education, mission, worship, and community. I never really thought about it that way. I just sort of, I don't know, I just haven't sort of highlighted it in that way. So I found that very, very helpful and stimulating. And I know certainly the folks in our group do it. And I think we wanted to sum everything up but with the great commandments, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbour as yourself, and to work that out. That is our calling. That is a massive challenge. We know we try and fail, but nevertheless, that is the high ideal that Christ has set for us. So we try to do that as we seek to be followers of the people of the way. So let us pray as we approach 12. Let us pray. God of love, we give thanks that you continually inform and challenge us. We give thanks for the words that we've heard today, for the discussions that we've been able to share, for the opportunities that have opened up, for the new insights and understandings. We know that we are called to be people of the way who fall short of your great glory. Yet you go on loving, leading, guiding and directing us. And so we pray that as we go our separate ways now, you will continue to be with us as we face up to the daily challenges, and bless us in this Advent time, that we might know your light and your love. And may the blessing of God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with us all this day and forevermore.
Amen.
Amen. And we are mute and then share together in the cacophony of the grace.
Praise
God,
the
Lord
Jesus
Jesus
Christ,
and the love of God,
and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit
Be with us all.
with us all evermore. Amen.
Amen. And we resume again next Wednesday at 10:30, and the devotions will take very much the theme of a Methodist way of life. So we look forward to that and to what Roger will have to share with us. Hope everybody can join us again next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, all.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
bye.